Uploading.
Proof that there are any founders on Cardassia.
The change in government is all the proof we need.
And what if you are wrong?
That would be unfortunate for the Cardassians.
Before I can effectively break down the events of the Klingon-Cardassian War, it's important to analyze the belligerents in the conflict. For the too long don't watch version, if you're intending to skip this chapter, well, the citizens of an authoritarian state throw off the shackles of their oppressors and form a more democratically aligned government, only to be attacked by another authoritarian, if not fascist, entity that wishes to take control and absorb them into their own nation. Hey, wait a second. Haven't I heard this before?
I was trying to reach someone in the civilian government.
And you have succeeded. You are speaking to the new chief military advisor to the Ditapa Council. As a loyal officer of the Cardassian military, I am pledged to serve the legitimate ruling body of the Empire, whoever that may be.
The first government to discuss is that of the Cardassian Empire. With the destruction of the near entirety of the Obsidian Order, which was the secret police and enforcer branch of the authoritarian government itself, and an already growing anti-establishment movement that had existed for a while, the military leadership that had long controlled the Cardassians would fall and a civilian government would rise in its ashes. From what we can tell, this organization was a marked change with a focus on its citizenry and possibly a rollback of the more totalitarian policies and an improvement to welfare of the overall society. The Klingon Empire, which had risen in power and prestige through feudalism, would find itself entering a more and more state of decay. The Empire was forced to no longer rely on conquest to feed its people and expand its borders. Now, in theory, the alliance that it had with the Federation and the change to a more peaceful stance would see changes and a revitalization within the government itself. Unfortunately, it was not the case, as politicians that rose up at this time still believed in the historic ways that the Empire had gained its infamy and its territory. The Dominion threat, along with changeling infiltration, fanned these flames and ensured that the Klingon Empire became more and more a hostile power. The United Federation of Planets, an ally of the Klingon Empire, was in the middle of a Cold War with the Dominion and was attempting to gear up for war that many believed they couldn't win. The Federation was attempting to bolster its Klingon allies, as well as rally the Romulans, Cardassians, and others against the impending doom, and they were having little success. While there would be other minor players, like the Maquis, within this conflict, those are the three that you need to be aware of. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's look at the invasion. Or at least let's look at the semi-invasion of the Cardassian Empire.
What if the Dominion has taken over the Cardassian government?
If my people wanted to seize control of Cardassia, that is how they would do it.
As discussed, the Dominion's attempt to destabilize the Alpha and Beta Quadrant powers was becoming more and more successful. The Battle of the Omarion Nebula had effectively removed the Romulan Star Empire from the board, and the Cardassians were in the midst of a revolution when their security forces could no longer keep the peace. The threats from abroad continued to subvert the moderate elements within the Klingon Empire, and the Federation was largely powerless to assist anyone. All of this was effectively a powder keg, and what lit it would be a coup by the civilian element of the Cardassians to overthrow the military. This change worried the highest echelons of the Klingon Empire, and again, thanks to those before mentioned changeling infiltrators, it was the common belief within the Empire that the Dominion had taken over the newly formed Cardassian Ditapa Council, the council being the civilian element that was now in charge of all Cardassians. It was thought that the Dominion might utilize the Cardassian civilian element to provide a staging area for Dominion forces. Due to this, the Empire would dispatch an entire fleet to the Bajoran sector, which, ironically, I guess they can just walk in due to the alliance with the Federation, even though it's Bajoran sovereign space, but we'll just ignore that. While this was occurring, the Klingons would become more and more erratic, including attacks on general merchants as well as an attempt to mine the Bajoran sector, like the entire Bajoran sector. Now, if you think of space, you can literally go in every direction, and they were going to mine, all of that. They were going to mine around the Bajoran sector so nobody could get in and out. And the crew of Deep Space Nine took this seriously, by the way. But anyway, we'll just ignore that piece of nonsense like any other critic does when they try to say Legacy is better than Kurtzman Trek and keep soldiering on.
There are many Klingons who say we have been at peace too long, that the Empire must expand in order to survive. Fear of the Dominion has given my people an excuse to do what they were born to do, to fight and to conquer.
Focusing on the topic of the video essay itself, the Klingon again became more and more aggressive in their actions, and at the beginning it made no sense. That was, until Starfleet was able to determine what their ultimate objective was.
But they are convinced that civilians could not have overthrown the Central Command without help.
So, by attacking Cardassia, they think they're protecting the Alpha Quadrant from the Dominion.
Sisko would confront Martok, and Martok, being the honorable warrior and definitely not a changeling, would take the counsel of the captain very seriously and return to his vessel, where the Klingon fleet would then attack Cardassia right out. And now, Starfleet was left in a bind. They could betray their allies, which apparently the Khitomer Accords meant that Starfleet would assist in mutual defense and wouldn't aid the enemies of the Klingons, even if the Klingons started an unjust war. So the Khitomer Accords are really an interesting piece. But anyway, they could betray them, or they could just let it happen. So in the end, they decide to betray their allies. Or did they?
According to our estimates, the task force should enter Cardassian space within the hour.
Don't forget the waist. I think I've lost a little weight.
Well, thank you, Captain. I believe I have everything I need.
Now, technically, Sisko's correct here, which, again, as everyone knows, is the best kind of correct, but I feel like this probably wouldn't stand up in a court of law. I really do feel like this would still be looked on as a betrayal, but let's just again bypass it. The Cardassians are alerted, but unfortunately they were still reeling from both the before-mentioned defeat at the Omarion Nebula and the uprising. The military put up a brave defense and were able to stymie the Klingon attack, but it wouldn't last for long as Klingon forces broke through the lines and made for Cardassia itself. The Ditapa Council would escape before the Klingons were able to capture them, and they would be saved by Starfleet forces. During all of this, the Klingons would pull out of the Khitomer Accords and the Federation would begin supplying aid to the Cardassians, which resulted in battles between Starfleet and the Klingons. And all of this would lead up to another powder keg, which ultimately resulted in another Federation-Klingon war. The two realms would be against each other yet again. To this point, I've been basically discussing step by step what happened, but that's not what I'm trying to do ultimately within this video. Believe it or not, I gave the background to really discuss some simple topics. That is specifically Gowron and the Klingon Empire.
They're not founders, Martok. We tested them. You were wrong.
It is of no consequence. All that matters is the Alpha Quadrant will be safer with the Klingon Empire in control of Cardassia. Now!
Because at the end of the day, this war, this entire war, is about Gowron. And ultimately, Gowron really reminds me of Blood and Soil, for those who get that illusion. Now, many will say, correctly, that Martok was a changeling infiltrator and had been manipulating Gowron, as well as the Klingon Empire, which is true. But when we really deep dive into it, Gowron was a petty politician that wished to be a dictator known for glory and the hunt. He wished for the Empire to be superior to everyone else and that his name would be highlighted throughout the generations. He was selfish, and it mattered more to him that he retain his power than it did knowing the truth or even defeating the Dominion. We know this because when it was proven that Martok was an infiltrator, Gowron continued to press against the Cardassians to not lose face. People died for his hubris. However, here is the scary thing. The Klingon-Cardassian War was about Gowron. That's not to be disputed. But that doesn't necessarily make the Chancellor wrong. While it is more difficult, democracy can be utilized to oppress people just as much as a dictatorship can. One, in theory, could trade one tyrant 500 miles away for 500 tyrants 1 mile away. The resulting coup to go into a democracy and civil actions did destabilize the Cardassian military, albeit temporarily, and created a gap that could be utilized by the Dominion. And even if it didn't, and this was truly a democracy, who is to say that the Cardassians wouldn't agree with the Dominion? After all, a tyrant you can manipulate, and that might be preferable to the will of the people. And let's assume that the Klingons didn't attack the Cardassians. What exactly is the fix? If the Federation and the Klingons demanded that the Ditapa Council go through tests to determine if they are changelings, well, that probably wouldn't have went well. I mean, why should they agree? The Cardassians have their own sovereign government. They have every right to decline these requests. And then what's to be done? Counterintelligence? Actual war with the Federation-Klingon alliance against the Cardassians who haven't done anything? Ironically, the question of how to handle this Cardassian coup when you're dealing with the Dominion is something that's a little bit more nuanced. What do you guys think? How should the Klingons and the Federation have dealt with the Cardassian Revolution? Was it yet another Dominion trick or something that was actually true? Do the Cardassians have the right to choose the Dominion if they had wanted to? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to rate, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.